Welcome everybody. We're just going to give it a couple minutes here while folks continue to join. Got lots of attendees. Just while we're letting people join, just a couple little Zoom reminders. If you haven't used Zoom much, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a couple of different options, raise hand feature, a Q&A where you can input questions, and then a mute button. You will be muted upon entry and we'll have to unmute you just to control audio a little bit and feedback throughout the meeting. And we'll remind you of those throughout, but feel free to test those out as we go. All right, looks like we're getting a fair amount of attendees here. And it looks like folks are testing their hand raise button. That's great. We are going to ask that you hold questions till the end of the meeting, just so that we can get through a couple of introductory remarks and a few slides here at the beginning, but then we'll give you a cue near the end of when to raise your hand and get some questions in the Q&A. And with that, I think I'm going to kick it over to Kelly Cunningham to get us started. Go ahead, Kelly.
All right, can you hear me? Yes?
Yep, loud and clear.
I'm a little nervous after our previous technical difficulties. So, hey, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight to talk about coastal steelhead. Before we dive into the agenda, I just wanted to take a few minutes to maybe set the table, so to speak. If we rewind and recall that last year, we closed the Chehalis and Willapa early due to concerns that we had that we wouldn't meet our management objectives prescribed in the statewide steelhead management plan. And as a result of that, many of us in the department spent a lot of time with many of you and others talking about the issues we were facing and explaining why we were doing what we were doing. And I think it's safe and fair to say that virtually everybody was frustrated, right? And many folks were angry. And, you know, in short, we felt like there was a lot of opportunity for us to improve our messaging as well as soliciting feedback from you all and other members of the public. So in an attempt to apply the lessons learned from last year's experience, we wanted to do things a little differently this year and into the future. So that's why we're here tonight. Again, last year we struggled with communication regarding both our concern for the fish and how they were doing, and also explaining our management actions. And I think it's fair to say that although our message was consistent, it was also pretty fragmented, and it wasn't as broadly distributed as it could have been. So this left a lot of people scratching their heads and questioning our decision making associated with the rules that we did put in place in the end. So tonight is our initial shot at applying those lessons learned and sharing what we know with you and getting your feedback in a different way. I mean, it's different in a couple of different ways, right? So we're not doing it face to face, we're doing it virtually. There's some pros and cons to that, but differently in that we're coming to you early. We're sharing with you what we know, and we're going to have the conversation. So having said that, I'm aware that there's a lot of concern out there. I mean, once our news release hit the street, the news release that announced this meeting, once it went live, my phone lines and my email boxes lit up. And I know that James had a very similar experience, if not a more extreme one. I personally view that as a good thing. I know James does as well. It means people care deeply about these fish and these fisheries, and there's a lot of passion out there. So that's good stuff. In that same vein, there are also a lot of perspectives regarding what we should do or shouldn't do. And again, that's one of the things we're here to talk about tonight. And in terms of those perspectives, I've heard everything over the course of the last 3 weeks. I've heard some folks who want us to carry on with our what we'll call status quo fisheries, right? Full season fisheries with no additional restrictions. And on the other end of that spectrum, some have been very clear that they believe we should close all of the fisheries coast-wide for the entire season. And then there have been folks that have weighed in with other suggestions that fit somewhere in between those two extremes. So that brings me to our agenda and goals for this meeting. Tonight, we want to share with you what we're seeing in coastal steelhead population in terms of both trends over time, what's happened in the past, as well as what we anticipate with respect to this year's returns. And as I mentioned before, we also want to get your feedback regarding moving forward with this year's fisheries or not. So James and his team have put together some information that serves to paint the coastal steelhead picture that we want to go over with you. And we've also put together some potential options that will serve to get the conversation started here a little later on this evening. I want to be clear that this isn't a decision-making meeting. This is an information sharing meeting. The options you will see tonight should be viewed as ideas and a starting point for the conversation. We're doing this to collect feedback from you that we'll use in considering coastal steelhead fisheries for this season. With respect to a little housekeeping, there are no shortages of issues and challenges that you may want to talk about in Region 6, right? We've got the Skokomish River issue. We've got north of Falcon, point, no point boat ramp. There's a lot of stuff we could be talking about, but we got a limited amount of time tonight, and we have a lot to cover in the 2 hours that we're together. So we need to be focused on coastal steelhead as our topic. We'll also be ending on time at 7 out of respect for you all. And if we don't get through all of the questions and concerns, you can reach out to James or myself. I think that you have our email addresses. If you don't, I think we can put those links in the chat, but I'll look for a head nod if that's something we can do. So with that, I think I'll pump the brakes here and turn it over to James to introduce himself and his team. And again, I want to thank you all for taking the time to be part of this conversation. Looking forward to it. Thanks, James.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Just confirm you can hear me all right there, Kelly.
Loud and clear.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, so Kelly pretty much, said everything that, was sort of intro for me, but I just want to kind of introduce myself. I'm the regional program manager focused on Region 6 fish populations. I'll show you a map of what that means. But yeah, I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm really excited about tonight. Maybe 10 months ago when we were up late on the phone trying to walk people through information, we recognized a whole bunch of information gaps, realized there was a ton of work to do. And so myself and the larger technical team sort of put this on the map as kind of something we wanted to achieve this year. We didn't know if we were going to be able to pull it off, bring all the technical information along with our co-managers and the Olympic National Park fish managers, get everything all in one place, a month or 2 months earlier than we typically have. So we put it out there as a goal, and I'm really just psyched that we're here tonight, and just extremely proud of this technical team. So I think that's probably the place to start, is maybe go around the horn here. Everybody that's a panelist can introduce themselves. This can be pretty cumbersome, virtually, but I think if we start from, maybe south to north and head into Puget Sound, that's a good way to do it. So maybe first, let's just all flip our cameras on if you don't have them on, like the WDFW sort of technical folks. So this is, the team that keeps this ship running. And we'd start with Jody Pope, who's in Willapa Bay, but she had a family emergency, about an hour ago. So we're bummed to not have her, but Jody Pope is the, senior level bio in Willapa Bay. So she manages those fisheries with a great team there. So then we can catch up with Jody later, but we'll go to Mike Scharf.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me just fine. I'm Mike Scharf. I'm the fisheries biologist for Queets, Quinault, and the Chehalis Basin, including hump tulips.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Whitney. I'm the district fish biologist for the North Coast and the Strait of Juan de Fuca, kind of from the Hoe through the Dungeness.
Good evening, I'm Mark Downen. I'm the district fish biologist for the Eastern Straits and Hood Canal.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Gabe Madel. I'm the district fish biologist for South Puget Sound, so primarily the Puyallup and the Nisqually populations.
And then we'll move to Rob Allen there. I see, Rob's screen's off, but I see that you're there.
Yeah, hi, sorry about that. Having some technical difficulties here. Hey, my name is Rob Allen, and I'm the hatchery operations manager from Dungeness around to the coast down to Willapa Bay.
Thanks, Rob.
And I'm Jim Jenkins. I'm the hatchery operations manager for Hood Canal and South Puget Sound.
And then Captain, good to see you tonight.
Hey, good evening. I guess I'll back clean up here. Dan Chadwick, captain for the region. For those that don't know, we have 5 detachments in this region with currently roughly about 20 officers. There's normally we'd have about 25 plus a sergeant. So that's kind of a snapshot of what we have force in this region. So glad everybody could join tonight.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Couch. I'm a communications officer in DFW's public affairs shop.
And hello, everybody. I'm Raquel Crozier. I'm a special assistant in the fish program and provide project management and policy support to the team. I'm also going to be your Zoom stewardess tonight, so I'll be reminding you throughout about how to find your raise hand button, how to enter a question in the Q&A. And that sort of thing. So we've even got a reminder slide that James will go to in a little bit that'll help hit on some of those.
So just to confirm there, you guys, folks on the line must be seeing this Zoom directions and etiquette slide. Is that right?
Yep, we got it up now, James.
Yeah, Raquel, you want to help me walk through this one?
Yeah, so we've got about 160 folks on the call tonight. So we are going to have you all muted at the beginning just so we can keep the audio under control. James is going to run through some slides at the beginning. And so as he goes, feel free to enter any questions you might have specific to the presentation materials in the Q&A. And we'll take those as we go if they're specific to a slide, or we'll hold them till the end if they're kind of broader questions. And then when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll ask you to unmute yourself if you have a live question. And if you're calling in from your computer, you can do that fairly easily. But if you're calling from a landline, you'll do that by hitting *9 on your phone, and we'll take those live. You can also raise your hand from a landline, which is funky, but you can do that Actually, it's *9 for raise hand, *6 for unmute. Don't worry about remembering those. We will remind you throughout. And then if you're having technical issues, please drop those in the Q&A as well. We don't have a chat feature on this one. And then just knowing that we've got so many folks on the call, we may not get to all the questions today. We will try. We also may not have the right technical experts to answer every question. So just keep that in mind and keep positive thoughts. We've got a great staff with good intentions here tonight. I hope that comes through in the presentation. With that, I'll kick it back to James to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Raquel. And yeah, these that last bullet there is really important, for me tonight, not just because it's great that we all stay positive, but we have a ton of information. It was really important to me to sort of bridge that information gap, and this is the place I think to do that. So before we get into the real meat of the materials and the challenging discussions, I want to make sure we sort of are all on the same playing field, and we're talking about the same thing, and we're agreeing on, sort of the basic facts as we move forward. And so that positive intentions is, if I'm moving us right along and you ask a question that, is something that we're not focusing on tonight, then, the intention isn't to dodge something that is likely really important, but just to get all this stuff on the table in this short amount of time, and make sure we got about an hour at the end to hear what you folks think. So that's the idea with that last bullet. So Kelly mentioned this, but I want to remind everyone, 2 main objectives: bridge that information gap, try to get all the information on the table that we think is important for these decisions moving forward. And then, gauge, kind of feedback from folks on some of these ideas we have. And really, the big second objective here is to hear something maybe we didn't think of, and we can, put that into our toolkit and take that back to the decision-making, sort of process. One last sort of piece here is that, this was kind of a natural place for us to gather with the public, natural time, not a natural place, but, it was the right time because, the next step in this process is where we meet with our, co-managers and we make decisions on fisheries moving forward. So that's the idea. Is right now, we've got all this technical information on the table, and we want to make sure the way, we're looking at this is consistent with our conservation objectives, and we've heard how the public feels about it. So if we jump into this, we've got these 5 agenda items. I'm going to move fast, but you've got the hand raising tool if there's just something technically you're struggling with here. And then we'll have plenty of time at the end if we kind of keep moving. So we're going to talk about steelhead management background, talk to you a little bit about the biology and stock assessment. Some of this will be super basic for folks, but others, hopefully we learned something. How we manage steelhead, these stock assessment tools we use. We're going to get everybody up to speed on the trends and the goals, sort of the data that we're using as we move forward. And then, the 2020-21 forecast. So these are projected returns coming around the corner, and then a bit into the long-term look. And then we're going to talk about potential fisheries options. So these are not all the potential options, but we've done the math and brought to the table kind of a structure for us to begin discussing, these 4 potential options. So we'll walk through those and hopefully hear some big ideas. So this is our map here. I've added these red labels too. These are hatchery programs, and there's smaller ones that aren't on this map, but this is, we're going to be focused on wild populations tonight because that's really where the conservation challenge is. But it's important to note there are these hatchery populations, and we'll touch on them. This is the map of Region 6. This is a good place for us to sort of, start, because this is the area I manage, number one, and all the folks you heard from work in this region. We're going to focus on the coast, these coastal populations, but it's important to note that we're framed sort of here on the coast by these ESA listed populations in Puget Sound, Hood Canal, and then of course as we move south into the Columbia River. So we're in a unique place here on the coast for that reason, a lot of reasons, but there's one big one there is we're not talking about ESA listings tonight. That's not where we're at on the coast, but we do have that, all around us. So if we start on this first bullet, steelhead management background, it's important to sort of highlight these constraints. So we have limited in-season tools. One example of this is you saw in Willapa Bay, we opened coho fisheries recently. That was because we had information in season that suggested there were more fish than we thought pre-season. For steelhead, they return in this sort of protracted time period over 4 or 5 months, and our tools in season are really limited. So we want to land on a fishery that we're really confident in. We have a bunch of uncertainty around effort shift. So if we close one river, how does that affect populations and fisheries in other rivers? That's due in large part just lack of in-season monitoring. So we really rely on catch record card data, and we'll talk more about that. We have a recent history of over forecasting. We'll specifically address this topic. Tribal co-management, this is a constraint. We manage our fisheries together as a team with tribal co-managers. So this is something that we're considering in almost every one of our fisheries here on the coast. And then we have clear escapement goals in most rivers, and we'll dig into that deep. So I'm not going to go through all these terms, but just important to note, I'm going to use words like this. And hopefully when you signed on here, you saw the ability to click on information that you could download on your own computer. And if not, I can direct you to this stuff later. So if you hear things, words you didn't know and you don't get a chance to ask that question or you're uncomfortable, email us and we'll make sure we clarify all these specific terms. Okay, so with all the species that we manage out here on the coast, we've got this set of sort of guidelines or framework. For steelhead on the coast and in the state, we use the statewide steelhead management plan as our guiding document. You can download this online. It's not a giant document. It's worth reading. For us, this is what we lean on for guidance. So what it says here is it provides a framework of policies, strategies, and actions that will lead to achievement of goals. So the major goal is, restore and maintain abundance for these steelhead populations. And we look at this from this lens with these, 4 major parameters. So these are really important. I'm going to read them out loud. There's something we're thinking about when we go back to the table to design a fishery. We're thinking how can we adequately promote abundance, productivity, distribution, and diversity. And we'll talk specifically about those 4, but it's really important to note that while the statewide steelhead management plan lays these 4 parameters out as targets, they're not all clearly defined for each river. The one that is abundance. So this is the one we talk about a lot, these escapement goals. And specifically, we've got these 2 triggers, we'll call them tonight, for these escapement goals. And this is really important, so I'm going to kind of pause and make sure we're all on the same page here. On the coast, we manage our steelhead populations for these escapement goals. So this first line here says, if the run size is greater than the escapement goal, so we've predicted a large run, we assure that the escapement goals are met. So we design these fisheries pre-season with high confidence that we're going to meet these escapement goals. Sometimes, in some years, in some rivers, we have forecasts. We believe that these runs, or our predictions are that these runs will come in under the escapement goal. So before anyone goes fishing, we have forecasts that suggest that runs will come in under the escapement goal. And in that situation, we're still in the presence of hatchery populations and potentially other species that we want to target, that we don't have conservation objectives on. So the statewide steelhead management plan, when we're in this scenario, describes us, as minimizing mortality to these wild stocks, specifically in no case exceeding 10% impact for all fisheries. So an easy way to think of that is if we have 1,000 fish forecasted to come in and the goal is 2,000, we give ourselves a 10% impact on that 1,000 fish. So that's 100. And we'll be in that situation here tonight. And so it's important that folks sort of are able to manage these two triggers. These are our major targets, along with these other 4 parameters. So that's a steelhead management background. I'm going to talk a couple slides here, get everybody caught up about this, focused on steelhead biology and stock assessment. So, this is, kind of a basic slide here. If you've ever thought about Pacific salmon or read a book on them, this is the type of slide you see, a life cycle, where, steelhead, like Pacific salmon, the other species we think about, they're anadromous, so they use freshwater and marine. In this particular slide I created, there's this a significant overlap between the freshwater and the marine, and that's not an accident. Steelhead are diverse, they use both environments, they use them in different ways. And if we draw lines sort of connecting these, two periods of their life cycle, we can see that, yes, in fact, they're using freshwater and marine, but there's also this loop here that brings this freshwater phase back to the adult phase without ever entering marine water. So these are our rainbow trout. These are resident life histories of steelhead, and they're an important component of sort of the larger understanding of our steelhead abundance. So if I walk through this slide I think is pretty handy to walk through, what this team that you all met here just now, what we're all working on, and this army of folks that are out there doing stock assessment work every single year. So if we start in this juvenile phase, we have both hatchery and naturally produced smolts going out to sea. We know a lot about hatchery fish. We release them and we estimate, how many we release each time. And we encounter both of them in these smolt traps. So this is one style of smolt trap that we use along, with our tribal co-managers, operate a number of smolt traps on the coast. These allow us to estimate the number of smolts that go out to sea, the origin, hatchery versus natural. And also we can collect scales from these fish. And that gives us information, that we know steelhead smolts leave at less than 1 year old all the way to age 5 or even 6 in some cases. I kind of want to highlight here, hopefully it flagged, other people flag this, that if a juvenile salmon spends, 2 or 3 years in freshwater, a species like steelhead, you can imagine that freshwater phase is pretty important and the habitat that's being utilized. So we're not going to dig deep into habitat work tonight. We have a lot to cover in 2 hours for these short-term goals. But it's important to note that, we're thinking really hard about this longer term goal that is habitat. So there's a big discussion about that happening that everybody's invited in on that one too. So as steelhead move out into the marine water, I've circled it here because this is really a critical part of their marine survival. We think that, anywhere from 80 to 95% of the mortality occurs during this first month at sea. And then also during that first winter, that overwintering period is extremely critical. So we don't know a lot about this phase. There's a whole bunch of people studying it and more information every year, but we have some awesome collaborative research to try to fill these data gaps. Kind of interesting note for the steelhead enthusiasts in the room. You may not have known, but steelhead have a really unique migratory pattern in the marine water. We know from catch data out in the ocean that they regularly migrate to the coast of Japan. So these are our steelhead populations moving off the continental shelf, in some cases rapid speed, all the way across the Pacific Ocean. To try to understand what the heck they're doing specifically, we've got specific studies in Willapa Bay and other places that we can talk about later in greater depth. So, the bulk of our information comes when these fish enter freshwater. They return to these natal streams, and segregate naturally by race and stock. So we're able to encounter these fish in tribal fisheries where we can, learn a lot about the run timing. So this little graph shows that, this is the run timing of wild fish as they enter the river. Here you can see these early timed steelhead that are coming in large part prior to the wild fish. So this is really important information for guiding these fishery management plans. We collect scales on these returning adults so we can, understand the fact that most of these steelhead are coming back at age 3, 4, and 5. Some are spending significant time in this ocean phase, so that's really important as we forecast. And then many of you are familiar with this little image. This is a catch record card, that we use to monitor these fisheries and have for, over 40 years. So that's our major monitoring tool in the absence of creel data in most rivers, important to note that. And then the bulk of our escapement estimates come from these spawning ground surveys. So this is a photo of my knee hanging out of a helicopter. counting a red. This is a salmon nest, or in this case, a steelhead nest. Steelhead are extremely spooky. We don't see like a chum salmon on top of a red spawning. So most of our stock assessment work is based on counting these reds across the watershed. And then this last little image is a picture of a hatchery. So we have hatchery populations throughout the coast. That's important to note. Some, you can see this arrows moving into the hatchery. Some are relying on natural populations for these integrated hatchery populations. And then of course, we've got those that are segregated that rely on hatchery stock for brood. So that's a lot of information we just shared. We went around the life cycle pretty rapid, but this is all stuff we should regroup on at some point because I imagine there's a lot of questions. For the purpose of this talk, to make sure we're on the same page, I'm going to zoom in on this spawning ground survey part. I mentioned that abundance is this major trigger that's really well defined in the statewide steelhead management plan and in most of our rivers. So the way we do this is we count these reds, we tally them up, we expand them for the number of fish that the literature suggests are creating these reds. A lot of information there, but what we get is this nice picture. This is the Chehalis River as one example. I think folks are familiar with this river. So we can see as we move through time here, we're moving from, the mid 90s, to almost to 2020. And you can see there's this sort of interannual variability. We've got these ups and downs in the number of spawners. So this is really our benchmark for success for that abundance parameter. We count these fish every year, these reds. You can see there's a picture of a red next to one of our stream surveyors. And we tally these up each year and we come up with estimates of spawners. We then compare that to the escapement goal. In the Chehalis, that's 8,600 fish. We can see in some years, the estimate of spawners are underneath that escapement goal or less than. And in other years, we meet that escapement target. And that's important because this escapement goal is where productivity is maximized. We fully seeded the spawning grounds. And in most years, reaching this escapement goal is what'll give us that long-term high productivity that we need to move through these, good and bad years. So another important component of this is you can imagine all of these reds or these spawners aren't occurring in the same places. The Chehalis River is a big river. There's a lot of tributaries, a lot of places for a fish to go. And when we think of parameters like spatial distribution and diversity, that's what we're talking about. When are these fish spawning? Where are they spawning? And which areas are more important than others? So I could take that graph we were just looking at and just fill it in. Where are we seeing these fish spawn? There's a lot happening here, and I don't need folks to, focus in really hard. But if you just focus on this green and yellow part, you can see that, that's the Wainuchi and the Satsup. So you can see relative to other areas, these are really important spawning, areas for steelhead. But it's also important, with the Cascades and the Willapa Hills and the Olympics. The Chehalis represents, genetically and geographically, really distinct places that these fish spawn. 3 distinct, genetic groups specifically. And so we can see that each one of these areas, has a relative importance in terms of number and diversity. And then in years of low spawner abundance, in some cases, we see real low spatial distribution or genetic diversity. And the reason I say that is we can highlight on 2009 and say, yeah, this was a bad year for escapement. But we can also see that this green, the upper main stem, represented a really large proportion of the total spawners relative to other years. And a lot of these other groups like the Nowakam or, the South Fork, the West Fork represented a relatively low proportion. So we would argue that in 2009, this was not our best year for spatial distribution. So that was a lot again. I hope folks saw something maybe they didn't know, or at least it got us all caught up with things that we were comfortable with in the past, and now we're up to speed.
Hey, James, before you move into the next section, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that are related to this around how we set escapement goals, how we work with co-managers, and then what kind of our approach is to reporting back out to the public on those dialogues and management decisions. Do you want to touch on those?
Yeah, thanks. So there was a few questions there. The ones I'm going to focus on for this part of the presentation are the technical ones. You know, how are these escapement goals met? I heard there, or how are they designed? So most of these escapement goals, you know, are not new. These are targets that we've had for a number of years, using, you know, to be honest, old data. But what's important, I think, to note is, you know, in the early and late 90s, when folks were developing these escapement goals, they were using a similar method that we are now. So a lot has changed in terms of technology, you know, in terms of effort, in terms of gear type. But what's really important is the targets that were set based on this number that represented the highest level of productivity haven't changed in terms of the way we count these fish. So that's really what we're targeting here is, you know, if we put 16,000 fish on the spawning grounds, are we going to see more adults back in the future? And specifically, are we going to see more juveniles produced? So at what point do we see this maximum level of productivity, you know, to ensure sort of that long-term goal for abundance? So I hope I got at that piece. The idea of, I think I heard some co-management questions and other things. If everyone's comfortable with that, you know, I'll move that to the end because I think we're going to have a lot of questions like that.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that gets us through the technical questions. We'll make sure to queue that one up at the end.
Yeah, and we can revisit that escapement goal question as well when we get to the end. So we're getting into, I think, the real meat of the discussion here when we talk about trends and goals. And so last year, when we were talking about the way I was viewing these populations and the way the agency was, it seemed like there was a mismatch in some cases. So the way I'm going to walk through this is I'm going to start with the Chehalis, and I'm going to show an estimate of run size, you know, for the earliest time we have data that we're confident in, to current. And so this lower axis, this horizontal one, the x-axis here, will not change, but you'll see in some years we don't have these early periods of data, and some years we do. So this will stay static, and then this vertical axis will change, you know, based on the number of fish, because each one of these rivers has a sort of different threshold or number of fish that it produces. So this line represents the run size. So this is the number of fish that returned before any fisheries occurred. This is total run size to the river. And in this case, it's the Chehalis. What's really important about this, I'll go slow on this one and move faster through the others, but you can see in the early 90s, we saw this, you know, pretty rapid decline in the total run size. And you're going to notice that with other systems too. This was really a coast-wide trend. We also saw this in Puget Sound. So it's important to note. On the coast, different than the Puget Sound, we've seen these subsequent increases in abundance. So we have these periods where we have a low number of steelhead and high number of steelhead. So we see these three kind of characteristic bumps or increase in abundance, with this most recent increase being lower than those earlier. I'm then going to add on the escapement goal like I've done before. So we'll have this dotted line that represents the escapement goal. So you can see in some years, the run size comes in below the goal prior to fisheries occurring. And then we can add on the escapement, and that gives us an idea of kind of our metrics of success. How did fish actually perform, you know, onto the spawning grounds? So I'm going to pause on this one, and I'm going to ask, maybe Raquel, you can help me. It's important folks understand the way this graph works, not so much, you know, the specifics about how we, you know, estimate these red counts, but I want to make sure people are understanding the way this graph works, because I'm going to show about 8 of it, just like this one.
Great. I'm not seeing a specific question in the Q&A at this point about the graphic, but if folks do have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A and we'll flag those for James.
Thanks, Raquel. So now I'm going to move just south of the Chehalis into Willapa Bay and show a really similar graph. And here everything came on at once. This isn't animated now, so you can see that we've got the black line is run size. and then the escapement in gray with the escapement goal. Something important to note about Willapa Bay is that we don't have tribal co-managers here that target steelhead. So you can see the distance between this gray line and the black line is really small, right? All of these mortalities associated with fisheries are occurring, by our sport fisheries. So you can see relatively low impact on these steelhead populations. And then this period in the mid 90s represents, prior to catch and release fisheries on wild steelhead. So during this period, this bigger space represents harvest on wild steelhead, directed harvest. If we move up to the hump tulips, again, you can see this period of decline in the 90s and then these subsequent bumps, these increase in abundance. Also notice sort of the steady decline, and then most recently, we in 2020 saw the lowest escapement on the hump tulips that we'd seen in the record. So this was the worst year we've seen based on this abundance parameter. This is the upper Quinault. Again, you see this decline in the early 90s, and escapement goal met, less than half of the period here. This is the Queets and the Clearwater. You could see similar decline in the 90s, and then these most recent values represent some of the lowest that we've experienced in terms of run size and escapement. If we look at the Hoh River, we achieved the escapement goal this last year by about 40 fish, so right there on the edge. But you can see again, we've got this decline, and then this sort of subsequent decline through most of this period, finding ourselves closer and closer to this escapement goal with these preseason run sizes. And then the final one I'm going to show you on the sort of coast proper is the Quileute River. Again, we saw this decline in the 90s, but you can see that we exceeded the escapement goal, missed it here right at the peak of this decline, but right there on the escapement goal, and you can see the rebound from that looks much different than the other populations, and that's worth noting.
Hey, James, we do have a question on the slide now, and it's around, where we see a difference between run size and escapement. Do we have data that allows us to, subtract out the sports fishing component of that versus the tribal fishing component of that?
Yeah, I would say, so the short answer is yes. These estimates are based on data between the gray and the black line, and we can partition these out by state and tribal harvest. What's important to note is our estimates of tribal harvests in most of these systems are pretty good, right? Steelhead are sold to a buyer, and there's fish tickets associated. And in the case of the Quileute, the one we're looking at now, we know sampling of this fish exceeds 60% in many years. So 60% of the fish caught have been handled, sampled for scales, sampled for genetics, and the relationship with the Quileute, is really good. So we have great data sharing. You contrast that with the way the state estimates encounters and mortality associated with that. We use creel in some cases on the Hoh. That's the place where we've got focused creel work, and then we bridge some of that into the Quileute River. But in other cases, we use historic catch record card data and make assumptions about harvest rates that now are exploitation rates or encounter rates. So we don't have a direct estimate of encounters and harvest by the sport fishery, rather catch record card data from the past when you could harvest steelhead applied to the current, and literature that suggests rates of mortality associated with catch and release fisheries. So the short and a long answer there.
Perfect. That's great, James. And I did notice there's a couple of suggestions from folks about the graphics, like, adding a regression line would be helpful, and breaking it into some of the other systems that are aggregated. So if folks, we obviously can't do that live, but if you have questions like that, you'd like to see some of this in different ways, follow up with James, he can help hook you up.
And so I really like this dialogue, and this is the stuff I enjoy talking about. So call me, email me, let's talk about it. Those two I'll just address real quick. And then if questions come up later about them, maybe we can remember what I said now. We use regression lines often to describe, trends, but specifically we use regressions to make predictions. And so I'm really hesitant to draw a line through one of these plots because it implies that we're predicting that that's sort of the trajectory we're headed on. There's no steelhead population in the coast that doesn't experience natural variability. There's ups and downs in productivity. And so my goal here was just to describe sort of what we know and not try to make any, sort of assumptions about where we're headed. But I think it's fair to do that. So I didn't do that here. And then I showed the Chehalis graph where we broke the escapement up by location. That was just a methodological slide so people see that we can do this. And so it's fair that we can do this anywhere. I shouldn't say anywhere, in most places. But most of these rivers we walk with the help, our tribal co-managers in Olympic National Park, oftentimes greater than 60% of the spawning ground. So we have a real good idea of that spatial distribution. In some cases, like in South Puget Sound, 100% of the spawning grounds or very close to it's walked. So on the Quileute, I don't want to go super deep here, but we could break this up by the Dickey, the Bogasheel, the Soul Duck and the Kalawa, and we have escapement goals for each one of those rivers. So it's a great point, and that's, I think, future discussion there. And then this is the last graph I'm going to show you for these trends. This is the Hoko River. Data quality is just not as robust here for a lot of reasons, but here we're looking at the escapement. There's no estimate of run size here, but just to point out that as we turn the corner into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, we see similar trends and challenges here. Okay, so that was a lot. Again, that was really the major data dump that I wanted to provide, and I spent a lot of time on the phone with folks walking people through that. And I hope that was a more efficient way. I know it was for me, and I know my wife thinks it is, than me, late into the night, but hopefully we all got something from that. So I think this is why we showed up. So we want to talk about forecasts. I'm going to show you 2 quick slides on how we do this, because I think questions are going to come up. This is another graph. I appreciate everybody that's challenged on the screen here looking through these graphs, but it's important to us that we're looking at the same numbers. So this is just an example to show how we calculate, or how we come up with forecasts. And so what we're looking at here is, now we're not looking at abundance or escapement, rather we're looking at survival. And I've put a picture here again of this spawning nest, this red, and then this adult return. And so what this is supposed to show is that for survival, we use the number of recruits per spawner. So from a spawner or 2 spawners, what did we see in subsequent generations? What did those fish produce? And that's really that productivity estimate. And what's important to note here is productivity or survival, it really changes through time. It's variable. We have this period we've talked about a lot now in the late 80s into the early 90s, where productivity was really low, in this case for the hump tulips, and dropping below 1. So that 1 represents the replacement line, where one spawner produces 1 recruit. And we've dropped below 1 regularly during the time period in the hump tulips and other places. But then we have these periods of really high productivity. And so what I want to show here is, when we forecast, we're trying to predict how the number of spawners are going to perform in the future to produce more recruits or adults. So the way we traditionally do this is we just calculate a recent year average survival. So what you can see is, if we take the last 3 or 4 years, we're right here, in this sort of low survival period. And then we could apply that to future spawners and come up with an estimate of the forecast. The challenge with this is, as survival declines through time, we're going to over forecast every time when we're in a decline like this. And in the same way, if all of a sudden we see a rebound, we're going to under forecast, because we're sort of always tracking right behind. So we're chasing those changes in survival. So for this year, for all of these populations, it's fair to say that we've experienced this low survival in recent years. So that leads to a low forecast in most rivers. But we know we're wrong in forecasts. Folks on the phone know we're wrong. So we often use these sort of more direct estimates of environmental variability to describe the situation steelhead probably dealt with. So the easiest one for us to think about is when the water's low and the temperatures are high, that's probably bad for a juvenile steelhead, and that can affect the subsequent adult returns. But something, you know, that's really gaining momentum over the last couple decades has been looking at sort of this more critical period, this ocean environment period when fish are just, steelhead specifically, are entering the marine phase of their life cycle. And so this is a graph. I'm not sure folks have looked at one like this, but this is essentially describing these broad scale patterns, you know, basin scale ocean conditions. And I'm not an oceanographer. I'm not sure if there are folks on the phone that are, but what I'm really asking for folks to digest here is that the ocean moves in these phases or regimes where we have these cold sea surface temperatures, high upwelling, you know, really productive ocean climate periods. We see that, you know, all the way to the base of the food web, we see different species of copepods all the way up to forage fish that steelhead feed on out in the ocean. So really the main point here is using the NPGO, the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation, calculated during the time right before steelhead go to sea, we can look at kind of how the table's being set for steelhead that are entering the marine phase. This is really important because we know in the past they've gone out in productive conditions, and more recently when fish entered the ocean in 17, 18, 19, 20, we're seeing some of the worst ocean conditions on record. If we take our steelhead survival values and plot that right alongside the NPGO, so these are averages of coastal steelhead survival from these populations we're talking about tonight, we can see that when the ocean condition was cold and productive, steelhead were, you know, experiencing, you know, this favorable ocean climate and responding to that. We saw these higher than normal steelhead survivals. And then we see these periods where, of course, the warm blob showed up. We heard about that in the news, and we saw steelhead responded with lower than average survival rates. This little blue speck here, we were calling this the blob hangover, where it felt like we were climbing out of it, but then we, you know, dropped back into this really warm, poor productivity phase. So as we look at these recent year survivals, we use these traditional estimates. That's what I'm going to provide folks today. They're really giving us a pessimistic look at ocean conditions, or excuse me, at steelhead survival and future returns. But I want folks to know that these are probably conservative estimates in terms of, you know, if we look at ocean conditions, they're really supporting this idea that not only are forecasts looking poor for next year, but we're likely going to see this in subsequent years, because we know that steelhead returning in 2022 and 23 are experiencing these poor ocean conditions that are on the books right now. So there was a lot there. So I might take a pause. Well, I guess sort of spoiler, I sort of moved to this table. So we'll keep moving, but feel free to flag a question on that last slide. So I don't like showing tables when we're on our presentation, especially over the computer here, but this is a quick snapshot of these preliminary forecasts for steelhead returns on the coast. There's a lot of numbers here, but the ones to focus on are this forecast, the expected number of fish returning, you know, based on our current understanding with tribal co-managers. There's a little bit of work to do, but I think we're really close. This is our goal, this escapement goal that we've talked about. And over here, I've done the math to show in these gray boxes, we can see places where the forecast before fisheries occur are expected to come in under the escapement goal. And then in places that are not in gray, you can see places where the forecast is coming in, you know, above the goal. And so if we look at the kind of go down the line, we can see that 4 of these 7 were expected to not meet the escapement goal. In some cases by significant margins. And then in 2 of these rivers, the Upper Quinault and the Hoh, we can see we are expected to be above the escapement goal, you know, but one might say not by a lot. And then the Quileute River, we're expecting 3,376 fish over the escapement goal. So a bit of a buffer on that one. So this information was provided online as well. So afterward, we can make sure folks are directed to it if they want to be able to print this out and really think about it hard at home. So we've gone through sort of the biology stock assessment, shown the forecast. I'm gonna now move into, just a few slides here that show, the potential fisheries options that we've laid out kind of as a structure just to start conversation. So I'm expecting that folks will have opinions about these options, and I'm also hoping that people have other ideas. The final option that we sort of move forward with in discussions with the co-managers may look like, sort of a morph between multiple of these options. But I thought we had a few starting places that I think would sort of aid in this discussion. So I'm going to start by describing the status quo here. So this is kind of where we've been, and I want to talk about why we're thinking that this likely hasn't been working for us in the past. So the description along the coast, if you've opened the pamphlet in the fishing rule book, it's diverse. We release all wild steelhead along the coast. But for hatchery steelhead, we have limits from 2 to 3. We have gear type regulations that vary from barbless hook to no bait to single hook to no fishing from a floating device. For our closure day, when the steelhead season ends, it ranges river by river from the last day in February. There's one river where it's February 1, but then it moves all the way to April 15th in some systems. So rainbow trout, this life history diversity piece that we've talked about, rainbow trout represent one component of this life cycle. Catch and release in some waters, but a minimum size of 14 inches in others. So a couple bullets on this status quo, if we look back at the information I just shared, we know there's declining abundance trends in the majority of coastal rivers, most of them recent, some of them long-term declines. The Chehalis and the hump tulips have failed to meet escapement goals in the last 3 of 4 years, and we've exceeded the 10% exploitation rate in 2 of the last 3 years. In Willapa Bay, we've failed to meet the escapement goal in the last 5 years. This bullet here is kind of hard to read, but it says exploitation rate less than 10%. So we feel we've met that conservation goal, even though we've exceeded that escapement goal. In the HOCO, we've got a failure to meet escapement goal in 2 of the last 4 years. We've got no estimate of exploitation rate. And then overall forecasts moving into the future are below the escapement goal in the majority of coastal rivers. And if they're above it, in many cases, they're right in that margin of error with our sort of forecasting inaccuracy. So I've laid out, these 4 options along with the team here. We've put these together, and I'm going to go through them one by one. I expect there's going to be questions, but I'm going to do a quick time check here. It's 6 o'clock. So if I move through these, then I think what we'll do is we'll be bouncing back and forth between them and really clarifying what we're talking about. So no urgency here if you feel like I'm moving right past them, because we can pop right back into them. So this first one represents an early closure. This is a real, or actually I'm going to stop there. So folks know sort of where our head's at. We're leaning on the statewide steelhead management plan. We're looking at these 4 parameters that are described: abundance, productivity, distribution, and diversity. We're interested in how much confidence we have pre-season in meeting these 4 parameters as we, if we decide we're going to move off of that status quo. And so ideally, based on biological criteria and the statewide steelhead management plan, we would be able to check all 4 of these boxes with an option. But we know this abundance one is the one where sort of have this clear target for these escapement goals. So first, this early closure potential option, this one, is one that came up a lot last year. We closed the fishery early, due to growing concerns. But this year, we're talking about, would this be a potential option moving into the season with a preset date? And this option is based on the premise that a March 1 closure would allow for a maximum effort placed toward these early timed hatchery programs and then would protect the peak of the wild run. So if people are clear on this graph, these open circles represent the forecasted run timing of early time chambers fish based on data from the last 20 years. And what we can see is March 1 represents that date when most of them have cleared the system. So the pros here are that we target early returning hatchery releases. You know, we protect the peak of the wild populations. The cons are that, you know, we've really got limited harvest of late timed hatchery steelhead. So in many of our waters, we have integrated populations that return, you know, very similar run timing as these wild populations. This potentially displaces anglers targeting wild steelhead. So there's some folks that really prefer this late period to fish. And then there's a risk of disproportionately affecting the early end of the wild run. So I talked about uncertainty around angler, a sort of shift in effort. So if we close this late period of the run, there's a question about where those anglers go. And if they move into this early period of run, this could have an effect on spatial distribution, diversity, and productivity if we think that these early fish in some years represent higher productivity than other times of the run. And so I've animated up here, these boxes have popped up, and what we can see based on you know, our modeling work is that there's high confidence that this fishery plan would meet this abundance target. So for stocks forecasted to come in under the escapement goal, we would meet that 10% exploitation rate. The second option I've laid out, I say of course, everybody understands that there's a group of us here, but this is fishing the Quileute only. So you can see on the map, we've got one river here highlighted. So this simply closed to fishing except the Quileute River and tributaries. So the pros is this, you know, provides maximum protection for these stocks at risk. So all of these populations that we are uncomfortable that we're going to meet the escapement goal are protected. The cons, you know, decreased angler experience potentially. You know, this would represent one of very few fisheries to target steelhead in the state of Washington. So that's a challenge. Uncertainty around effort shifts. We don't know if people hang up their fishing rod or if they all decide the Quileutes to place. There's concerns for tribal co-managers, or excuse me, from tribal co-managers, specifically the Quileute tribe. Displaces some user groups and economies. So how this displaces user groups is really uncertain. We know there's anglers across the coast, but we do know there's an economic impact to closing, you know, a 4, potentially or 5 month fishery on the coast. So again, you know, we think we could meet the abundance criteria everywhere. We could model about, you know, 4 times the number of anglers on the Quileute, and we're confident we would meet that escapement goal on the Quileute. But there's uncertainty about how that would affect productivity, distribution, and diversity for the Quileute River. We don't know if, you know, that angler effort would shift during the early time or the late time. You know, there's just a lot of uncertainty because that's something we haven't tried before. So the third of the 4 options here has to do with gear restrictions. So this is a combination of gear restrictions that would provide added protection for wild steelhead. Specifically, it would reduce the number of wild steelhead encountered. So the specific restrictions we're talking about here, the description is a bait restriction coast-wide, no fishing from a floating device in select waters. There's certain waters that would be unsafe to get out of a boat and fish. Those would likely not be part of this regulation, but this is what we've got listed. And then release rainbow trout to protect those life histories. We know that rainbow trout produce smolts, anadromous steelhead. So estimates around that are variable and uncertain, but that would be part of this regulation. So the pros for this one, you know, this maximizes time on the water. In some cases, it may expand, you know, a fishery that did close on March 1 or March 30th, by lowering encounter rates, it may actually expand particular fisheries. Consistently protect steelhead in all areas, times, and at all stages. So, you know, there's sort of this consistent regulation coast-wide. And then it allows for harvest of early and late timed hatchery steelhead. So fishing during both components of the run. And then the cons, this displaces some user groups or styles of fishing potentially. And then there's an enforcement challenge here. We do already have some no floating from a device, no fishing from a floating device regulations on the coast. So we've got some ideas on how to do that, but it'd be a challenging one for an already limited enforcement staff. So this one, there's high confidence that we would meet all 4 of these parameters with a regulation like this. And then this is the last option that we've, potential option we've put out. And this is a coast-wide closure. So, this is the easiest, not sort of socially, but this is the easiest as a fish manager dial to turn. So this was closed fishing in coastal rivers, December 1 through April 15th. So this provides the maximum protection for wild steelhead on the short term. The cons, no access to hatchery origin returns. So we've got hatchery fish spawning in the wild. Closure on rivers where escapement goal is likely to be met. So, we'd have a unique situation where the Quileute River has over 3,000 fish and we would close it in this option. Impact to economy of coastal communities. And then, this last one is pretty important. It's one we talk a lot about, but it's really hard to quantify. We displace important advocates. So if we're talking about sort of long-term success of steelhead management, we know that those that interact with them are sort of the first to stand up as passionate, steelheaders and sort of fight for the long-term recovery. So that's a major con with a coast-wide closure. So I'll pause there and maybe, so I guess I've checked off all boxes here, but I've got this sort of summary slide that describes, these 4 regulations. This is my last slide that we've got tonight. And then, these sort of management targets that are described in the statewide steelhead management plan. We can see how we've, tallied these up and hopefully folks can get into our heads a little bit about, as fish managers. So I'm imagining some questions have come up. I'm going to put this slide up here because I think there's some Zoom reminders for folks that are wondering, they've had a question the whole time and they're wondering how to get it out the door. Specifically, we're going to take a lot of questions. We got about an hour to do it, a little less than that. But specifically, we're really interested in, sort of the social, feelings on these different regulations we provided, and maybe there's a dream regulation that you've thought of that we haven't heard. So I'd pause there and take questions.
Perfect. Thanks, James. And we'll take some live questions first. We've got a bunch of folks with hands up in the queue. So we're going to start with James Trussell. And James, just a reminder that you'll have to unmute yourself on your end, but I've just allowed you to talk. So go ahead and unmute.
I think I'm unmuted.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Do you have I submitted 6 questions. What question do you want?
How about you hit us with your first one, or maybe the one that's the most burning, just because we've got around 50 questions in the queue and we want to spread the love a little bit.
Okay, so if you close the season coastwide, do the natives still get the fish?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's important for folks to note, and this could have been a topic earlier on, is, we don't manage tribal fisheries, right? We co-manage with them. So we're going to move into a planning process here and come out with a management plan. And if we bring to the table that we propose in a particular river, or in this case, coast-wide, that we're going to close fishing, I think it makes a clear statement about our concern for steelhead. And I'll be honest, we've heard that the tribal co-managers also have a concern, a conservation concern in many of these waters. So I can't speak to how the tribe's going to fish this year. That's the next step. But I think if we closed our entire, fishery along the coast, we would probably be communicating pretty clearly the level of our concern.
That's what I wanted to know, because, you know, if they're still fishing, if sport fishermen aren't fishing, it really, you know, makes me wonder why it's closed for us. So yeah, that's pretty much my only question. Maybe another one is plugs, fishing plugs. They really don't work well with single hooks. I've ripped a lot of fish's eyes out with single hooks on spinners and spoons, which I kept if it was legal to. But you know, plugs, they don't fish well with single hooks, and I wouldn't care if they were barbless or barbed. So I mean, maybe that's a regulation you could change. I don't know.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Great, thank you, James. And James Losi, there's a couple of just kind of technical questions I want you to hit about these options, maybe before we take a couple more live questions. One is there an opportunity to have a combination of these, or are we stuck in a place where we'd only take one? Another question is, when we talk about closed waters under option 3, do we have a sense of where those areas are in mind, or have we settled on that yet?
Yeah, so a couple things there, and I think the best way to do this will be maybe fill in a couple gaps here as I move fast through them. So option 3, you know, there's no closed waters, but I think, you know, just I want to be real clear, these are not fixed options. These are not the only 3. So yeah, I see flexibility between them. The thing about these 4 options is all 4 of them provide confidence that we will meet our escapement goals. The status quo escapement goals or our 10% exploitation rate, the status quo does not provide that confidence because we've seen that it has not been working well for us. So this gear restriction, you know, we've got a bait restriction. So the savings to wild fish, if I say savings, what I mean is savings to encounters on wild fish, are not based on the idea that bait is harmful to wild fish, even though there's a variety of studies that suggest it is. We're basing this restriction purely on encounter rates. So we know in Creel and the Hoh River and in other places, bait is extremely effective at catching steelhead. And so we're assuming a 25% savings is conservative associated with that regulation. In places where we already have bait restrictions, much of the Olympic Peninsula, you can imagine a bait restriction wouldn't provide any savings. So if there's a suite of regulations that we apply across the entire coast, they would need to be a combination. So no fishing from a floating device. Again, you know, there's really solid data that suggests that fishing from a floating device, you know, is really effective. And in some cases, specifically on the Hoh River, encounters from the community that fishes from a floating device in some years and some months, you know, is greater than 5 times that from folks that are getting out of their boat and fishing from the bank. So I hope that clarified a bit of that. But yeah, big ideas, like there's ways we could move these things around if we have confidence that we'd be meeting these criteria.
Perfect. Thank you, James. And I think we'll go back to another live question. And next on the list, we've got Nathan. Nathan, I'm going to unmute you now. You'll have to unmute on your end.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. So thanks, guys, first off, for putting this out. This is great. My name is Nathan Arith. One of the things I'd like to see is when we're talking about the Quileute system, I'd really like to see a bogey and a sawduck breakdown. I think having those two combined is kind of hiding some of the figures and showing maybe where the sawduck is keeping our average up and the bogey is falling flat on its face. As far as the forecast goes, I'd actually like to talk about the chum really quick. I'll call out.
Yeah, maybe Nathan, just so I can stay focused here, let me grab that first one.
Yeah.
So that question you asked, maybe, so I'm thinking we do this every year if folks find this productive, and we're going to get better at knowing what folks want to hear about. So I've heard that from a couple folks. We could do that for every river, you know, Willapa Bay, Doty, let me just finish here. Jody and Lyle Jennings, they cover, greater than 50% of the spawning ground. So we got a great picture of what happens there. Specific, and this is kind of across the board. Specifically for the Quileute, you mentioned that the sole duck may be lofting up that total escapement. I wish I had the graph in front of me, but the best way to describe it is, the Kalawa River meets its escapement goal, its specific escapement goal, almost every single year. The sole duck, is pretty variable, but in most years we meet that escapement goal. And then the bogus eel, in recent years, like the last 3, we've been challenged to meet that escapement goal. And there's questions about, there's a lot of questions, but one big one is, the quality of that habitat for spawning. There's a big slide up there that a lot of people are more familiar with than me. But so those moving pieces would be important. But I think the big shining star there in terms of meeting escapement goal, just to be super clear, the Kalawa, is a real high performer there in the Quileute.
Correct. Okay. So moving on, some of the things I had about our options here going forward. I'm actually like to bring up the chum forecast for a quick second, because I know Mark Downen and Jim, I know for a fact you guys aren't seeing many fish, and I know for a fact the Hoko hatchery has 0 steelhead at the hatchery rack right now. We all know there should be about 40 fish there, historically speaking. So looking at those runs going kind of not knowing where they are and having people waiting in the wings for them, it shows that our steelhead, your guys' forecast might be accurate. I'm a little more of a fan of the total closure, but I think odds are, as far as compromise go, we're going to end on number 3, modified, with certain rivers being closed that are dangerously under escapement, like the Chehalis, maybe the Willapa, not to mention Nasal if we're there too, and then trying to still maximize fishing opportunities for other people, but still a bait restriction and no floating device would probably be, in my, be my opinion, and obviously as well as the releasing all rainbow trout, which is something we should be doing in anyways. I think your proposal paints a pretty dark image, as it should, and I think we need to realize that the MSY modeling figure does not work anymore, and we need a little more buffer room, if not because of habitat loss, but because of rain freshets and scouring that we're not accounting for in our models nowadays. That's the end of my comment.
Hey Nathan, I appreciate that. Thanks. And just so folks know,
I'd like to say one more thing if I could. I would like to lobby for a North Coastal Steelhead Committee again. I think that's something that we need to have, and have that information out there again, as well as something as simple as going back to weekly or bi-weekly reporting from guides, so that we can retain that data and find out what they're encountering in the field. That's something we did back in the 90s. I see no plausible reason why we aren't doing that nowadays, except for possibly personnel not being able to handle all that data. That's the end of my comment.
Got it. We're taking notes on all that, Nathan. Thanks. And important to note, when I'm looking over here, I'm looking at my other screen, not yelling at the kids or ignoring folks. So that's what I'm doing over here. But I'm thinking we must have another question there.
We got a lot of hands up. So thanks, Nathan. We're going to go next to Dylan. And Dylan, I'm just unmuting you on our end right now. You'll have to unmute yourself as well.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hey, thanks for putting this on. I think most of us would be supportive of whatever short-term drastic measures it takes to protect, in the short term, what is kind of a precipice right now with wild steelhead. And none of us want to be the guy that shoots the last buffalo. So I think, we'd be open to whatever closures need to take place. But my real question is that, these short-term closures and regulations and restrictions really amount to rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And so my question is, really, are we looking at why we're in this situation in the first place? And I would argue that, there's some coincidental things going on, that when you look at the rivers that are way below escapement, those are the rivers that I believe have the highest amount of hatchery production going on, whereas the rivers like the Sole Duck, which is a wild steelhead gene bank, are performing better. And you know, I'm just wondering if you're looking at the big picture. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's entirely possible that the hatchery production is what has caused a lot of these rivers to have crashing wild steelhead populations. And the fewer hatchery fish we put in seems to be higher percentage of fish above or at the escapement goals.
Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, appreciate that.
Perfect. We're going to go next to Ty Watt. And Ty, I'm unmuting you right now. So you'll need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, guys. You hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Right. So I'm Ty Wyatt, and I have it. I guess, so my question here and concern ongoing is not as much this year, is the future trends in steelhead management. And you said it best that the biggest advocate for steelhead are those fishing pools. And if we continue down this road of closures, we're going to start to run out of people who care about it. So my question is there a goal here to maybe transition to some better ways of factoring estimates such as creel versus spawning ground surveys, especially considering that your intra-year comparisons have so much bias because of different conditions?
Yeah. Thanks, Ty. Yeah, for your question about, you know, sort of data quality, I mean, we could do better, no question about it. The thing that's unique with the data I showed is that we've, you know, really stuck on this similar method through time. So the thing I think is really important to focus on is sort of this relative trend, knowing that, you know, our estimates of number of fish on the spawning grounds are not exact, just like our forecasts aren't. But I think the real low-hanging fruit, you mentioned it there, is creel estimate. And this is something that's, you know, been underfunded, but as we, you know, sort of the margin of error here gets tighter and tighter, and we're really, you know, scraping to produce a fishery that meets our conservation objectives, I think that creel work is going to be really important, along with, you know, refining our escapement methodology. So yeah, you brought up some good points.
I guess I just want to finish with qualifying that if we're not catching the fish, our impact isn't qualified. So that's the importance of the creel.
Thanks.
But yeah, thanks again, guys. Thanks for all of this. It's awesome.
Thanks,
appreciate
Ty.
it.
And we're going to go next to Leander Geist. And I'm just unmuting you right now. I apologize if I got your name wrong there. You're going to have to unmute yourself on your end as well. I think it's Leander. Leander, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Lee, feel free to send us a message. Oh, there you go.
There he goes. Looks like you're unmuted. Try with your audio, Lee. All right, we're going to go to the next person and give you a chance to double back, see if we can get that audio working. Next, we're going to go to Bill Meyer. Go ahead, Bill. You'll have to unmute on your end.
Hello, guys. Thanks for making some time for the questions here. I do have, you know, I live in Forks, so I'm concerned with the Quileute system, you know, under option 2 there. And it just leads me to some thoughts here. When we look back to your guys' graphs, we look at our escapement goals just being a straight line, yet we're showing ocean conditions varying up and down. And it seems to me that by looking at that, even though, you know, we're 3,300 fish above escapement, you know, what is the reality of that if we're looking at poor ocean conditions showing that trend where it's going down, where, you know, we think that we have this buffer and potentially we couldn't have that, you know, that buffer may not be there, you know. So what is your guys' confidence in that is the situation?
Yeah, I'll tell you the way I think about it, and this is a big topic. That escapement goal represents, in average conditions, the number of fish we think we need to sort of support that long-term stability of the population. The risk comes when we don't meet the escapement goal during these real low productivity periods, these poor ocean conditions you're talking about. So a recipe for disaster, as you can imagine with any animal, is very few spawners with really low productivity. That just isn't an answer for long-term success. So ideally, in a situation where we predict low productivity, we meet our escapement goal. That number that we've agreed is important to put on the spawning grounds for future generations. So that's that's one of the reasons that now's the time to be having this meeting, because we're headed into likely, tough conditions, not next year, but also the year after and the year after potentially. So this is when these tough decisions need to be made if we're going to change the trajectory, trying to put these fish on the spawning grounds at a time when we need to. So yeah, I think that's kind of the point you were bringing up.
Absolutely. My point in short is that it seems like our escapement goals should be higher, especially when we can tell these ocean conditions before our fishery happens. It seems like our escapement goals should be increased. It's just a thought.
Thanks, Bill.
All right, thank you, Bill. We're going to go next to Carrie Hoffman. And Carrie, I'm just unmuting you on our end, and you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Hey, Carrie.
Okay. Hey, this is Carrie Hoffman, Vice President of the Grays Harbor Guide Association. I represent about 30 guides in Grays Harbor County. Anyway, our standpoint for a lot of this is conservation first. If the fisheries can't sustain it, then we'll be the first to acknowledge it and say we should be more cautious. My next statement is closures are kind of a sign of something being mismanaged. It's not necessarily our impacts on the fishery. It's the duty of the department and co-managers. This is the first time we've had this conversation, and this information's been available this early. It's kind of been a surprise to a lot of us of the fisheries that are going on, and it's just kind of a throw our hands up in the air moment here of what do we do. There's a couple of really good options, but as Ty Wyatt said and a lot of other people have said, a full closure and you're going to lose a lot of interest and a lot of advocates. I grew up fishing Puget Sound and can tell you don't recover from closures. They're really tough to recover from that. So other than that, I want to thank you guys for having this opportunity tonight.
Thanks, Carrie.
Great, thank you, Carrie. And we're going to go back to Lee and see if we can't get Lee unmuted here. You are going to have to unmute yourself, Lee, on your end. All right, Lee, we'll follow up with James. We're not able to get your audio through.
And Lee, you've got my contact information too. I hate to see you not be able to, speak up. So feel free to shoot me a text later and we can talk about the issue and make sure it's in the pool here.
Great. We're going to go next to a caller calling from phone number 253 ending in 1126. And I'm unmuting you. If you're calling from a cell phone, you can unmute yourself. It looks like you just figured that out. So go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, so this is Patrick Gaffney. My personal opinion is I would vote for option one, refine that a little bit. Say, looking at the graph of the wild run versus hatchery run, I say we back that down to about February 20th. You have to keep in mind that I think you're getting your data when the hatchery fish hit the trap. It's much later than when they're actually accessible to catch in the system. So I think that graph is a little off on when your best opportunity is to target those fish. Of course, I'm speaking for all anglers. You know, it's economically, you know, opportunity. It's the best option. Of course, closing the whole thing down is going to be best, but nobody wants that. But I would also suggest that, you know, the areas that have the best escapement, why can't we shift our creel off of those, considering the Quileute system in the Hoh has the best creel surveys, shift that effort to the areas that do not. And so we can get a little better data from what's going on with the angler participation. And then we have to keep in mind, take a look at the Quinault, the upper Quinault, and what they're doing and how they're, every year they're overperforming, it seems like, and see what they're doing and compare that to what we're doing in our fisheries and try to mimic that, if you would. I mean, that's just my thought on it. So, and then I wanted to know, when is the timing of the stream surveys? Is it mid-season? Is it in April, May? I've never really heard when you guys are doing that information.
Yeah, so I'll answer the second one first. And the target there is every 7 days. You know, we say 7 to 10 days, we're walking the spawning grounds, and there's pretty complicated regime in how we do it. Certain index areas and supplementary areas, we fly certain stretches of remote, you know, wilderness. And you know, we focus primarily from March 1 on, when most of those hatchery fish, you know, are done spawning, and the wild fish spawners really pick up. So the graph you're seeing is run timing, not spawn time. So that's the time period. And then for the creel question, you said some important things there, Patrick. And if Jenny can still hear us, I'm assuming, you know, she's on her toes, and maybe she can speak. We've had some big ideas about how to refine and improve our creel survey on the Hoh. So Jenny, if you're cool with it, maybe you can help me understand that shifting idea Patrick talked about.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Patrick. It's definitely been one of the limiting factors, is that we have really good data for the Hoh, or pretty good data for the Hoh, and not very much for anywhere else. And so it's something we've been talking about internally as well, perhaps alternating rivers, perhaps just getting a more limited creel in a broader range of rivers, like just CPUE, rather than the really hard part to get in creel surveys is the effort. How many people are there? Because it's hard to be in all parts of the river at all times. So you got to do expansions there, but I think that's a great idea.
Great, thank you,
Jenny.
Patrick. And we're gonna go next to Tally, and I'm unmuting you. Tally, you're gonna have to unmute on your end as well. Tally Ramsfield. And just a reminder, if you are calling in from a phone, it's *6 to unmute yourself, but we've got you unmuted on our end. All right, Tally, we're going to come back to you and go to Tom Moonen next. And Tom, we've got you unmuted on our end. Oh, Tom, can you try your unmute button one more time?
Can you hear me, Raquel?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
How's it going? My name is Tom Moonen. I'm the president of the Grays Harbor Sport Fishing Coalition. And I have to say, you guys, how and why we got here is pretty ridiculous. While I appreciate the opportunity for the department to host this town hall and share with the steelheading public possible scenarios for the upcoming season, to us, this seems really a little too late. And you said it best, Kelly, at the beginning of the meeting, that you guys are managing for status quo. That is all the department has done up until this point. We saw the same thing happen in Puget Sound 20 years ago, but that didn't change anything out here for management on the coast. Conservation and putting fish on the gravel isn't a concern until it's too late. Less than 2 years ago, I sat in your office with Larry asking for a small, simple regulation change for the hump tulips, to which you guys said there is no conservation concern for us on the hump tulips. And now where are we with the hump tulips forecast? The fact that we're sitting here only 6 days before the official season starts is a joke in itself. Why weren't we discussing this 3 months ago? But my bigger question is, what are your plans to prevent us to get to these emergency situations and potential closures in subsequent years? It's apparent that the department has no plan for the Chehalis system, Willapa Bay, or the North Coast. I know you've heard it batted around before, but I truly believe that if we're going to make any progress on coastal steelhead management, the department needs to convene an advisory group to develop a management plan for coastal steelhead. It's a democratic consensus-based process that brings in representatives from the steelheading community, and with clear objectives and goals can be a very effective tool to help you guys, the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Otherwise, it's basically, as we've seen this far, a wing and a prayer, and guaranteed your management will run these fish into another ESA listing for the state. As far as options go, I'm going to say 3 with some possible changes to it. No fishing from a floating device, I feel, is very discriminative towards certain user groups that otherwise would have no access to the resource. But if we're headed down this road of continuing to not meet escapement, which is the trend that we're on, shut us down. And that means for everybody. And we need to stop treating these systems as whole systems for fisheries. The Chehalis Basin, for example, break each tributary down on the Chehalis Basin and manage those systems individually. I saw on your graph you had data for the SATSUP alone, but you're not accounting for data in the West Fork, the Middle Fork, or the East Fork. I think that there's a way to take a system such as the SATSUP, close the West Fork and close the Middle Fork where there's no hatchery opportunity, leave the main stem open and the East Fork open, leave the Wainuchi open. But because you guys manage this Chehalis Basin as a whole, you're forced to close the whole thing down. And until we get past this and come up with a better plan and alternative, we're just going to keep going down this same road. So that's all I've got.
Took some notes there, Tom. Thanks for your feedback.
Thank you, Tom. All right, we're going to go to the next caller. I do want to just mention that we've got a bunch of hands still up and lots of questions still in the Q&A to get to. So please try to keep your question to one thought so we can spread the love a little bit and get to as many people as possible. So next we're going to go to Bridget, and Bridget, I just unmuted you. You're going to have to unmute on your end.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, hi, Bridget.
Hi, James. Hi, everybody. My name is Bridget. I'm the president of North Sound Trout Unlimited. First of all, thank you so much for putting this together and for genuinely seeming receptive. For what it's worth, I'm going to put in my advocation for a coastal steelhead advisory group. I think relying on the statewide steelhead management plan to manage these fisheries is inadequate. It worked in the Puget Sound to have this comprehensive management plan put together by a variety of stakeholders in the Puget Sound Advisory Group, Steelhead Advisory Group. And I think that's the best way to go moving forward long term. On a personal note, I would caution the department from saying that tribal co-management is a constraint. I don't think that linking the responsibility of the state to co-manage the fishery with such a negative term is a good idea. So that's just a personal thing. But thank you again for this, and that's all I have.
Hey, Bridget. Yeah, took some notes there, specifically on your second topic. Really appreciate your opinion, sort of your, perspective there. And it's worth noting to, everybody here, we're really proud of our relationship with tribal co-managers. And when we show spawning ground escapement data and stock assessment work, it's pretty important to demonstrate there. We've got sideboards, treaty rights that we, honor and respect and view with that word constraint, but are really proud of with those relationships. So thanks for that perspective.
Great. We're going to go to Evan next. I just unmuted Evan. Note boom on our end. You'll have to unmute on your end. All right, one more chance, Evan. Note boom. All right, we're going to, oh, I see you just came unmuted.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep, we can. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks again for putting this presentation together. Really quality job laying out everything going on. My question is off topic a touch. Just wondering, as far as ocean conditions are concerned for you guys in relation to our winter steelhead population. We did see a pretty good bump in coast-wide coho populations. Is that any sort of an indication of ocean conditions ahead of our winter steelhead run? Are those two populations totally unrelated as you see survival rates in regards to ocean? Thanks again for the presentation, guys.
Hey, Evan, appreciate that. So for your question, just to kind of repeat it out loud, our survival rates, between coho salmon and steelhead correlated. And so this is a question that's come up over the last year. And the first time I heard it, I sort of was like, yeah, that's, a little bit silly because these fish are, real, they're just different. They have different life history patterns in freshwater and marine and ocean migrations. But you hear the question enough times and you stop thinking it's silly. So we dug into that just, on the fly. We took adult returns to the Quileute for both steelhead and coho, adult returns for the Chehalis, both steelhead and coho, put those next to each other. And what we notice is, the freshwater period is much different for those two species, but it's important to note that they both rely on a sort of freshwater rearing period that's extended compared to things like chum and pink and even Chinook salmon. So they do have some similarities there. They both deal with that early marine period. And what we notice is during, catastrophic ocean conditions or anomalously productive ocean conditions, we see they both respond in similar ways. So you'll see a really big coho year will often, in these two rivers we just looked at on the fly, will result in, really big, steelhead returns. Similarly, in the 90s, as things decline, we saw not only steelhead and coho, but a number of species decline. So yeah, there's reasons to think that they move in tandem in some cases, but the life history of steelhead is much more complex. I think that's the easiest, sort of way to characterize them. Also worth noting that coho did something that none of us expected in the last couple of years. We see growth rates in the marine environment have just been through the roof, and that hasn't always related to high survival. So it looks like the ocean under current climate conditions is not only poor, but it's also super patchy. So there's locations of extremely, high productivity that are small, and then these, vast expanses that maybe we could describe as a desert. So yeah, complicated time, but it turns out that relationship isn't tight between coho and steelhead, but in some years we do see them line up.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great question.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Evan. We're going to go next to a phone number starting with 253 ending in 7460. You should be unmuted on our end, and you'll have to unmute yourself or use the *6 command if you're calling in from a landline. That's 253-7460. All right, last call for phone number ending in 7460. You'll have to unmute yourself. All right, we're gonna move to the next phone number. We're gonna go next to a 206 number ending in 2743. Looks like you're unmuted.
Great,
Go
thanks
ahead.
for taking my question. Yeah, so I just wanted to counteract what one individual had said earlier, Dylan, with regards to hatchery steelhead causing the decline of wild steelhead. Obviously, he has not paid attention to the Nisqually River, which has discontinued their hatchery program for now a couple decades, and the wild steelhead have not returned. If he would also take some time to look at the quarter study done in Oregon, he would see that there is been no reaction or interaction between the hatchery steelhead on wild steelhead populations. I wanted to ask for the Chehalis system if the main stem of the Chehalis could be closed, but those tributaries with hatchery fish could remain open, and if that would then increase our ability to fish on hatchery steelhead. And can I mention one more thing is I've been a big proponent of asking if the department could, in their mating of steelhead, and this would be for salmon also in the hatchery environment, if they could not do the random mating that they do currently, and instead take the largest fish of each year class and try to do mating across those larger fish. Another commenter earlier talked about the Queets and the Salmon River and what those native folks are doing out there in their hatchery, which is proving to be successful year after year. Matter of fact, they have a world-class fishery there for winter steelhead. They are doing and mating big on big. So is that a possibility that we can implement that?
Yeah, so I'm going to pivot to Rob Allen. He's been thinking a lot about creative spawning methods on the coast. If he's listening, he was having some tech issues a little earlier. And then while we do that, I have that graph about coho versus steelhead that we pulled up, and I'll stick that on. So a couple different topics are going to be discussed, but we'll be efficient here. So Rob, you around?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, you know, I don't know if I should turn my video here too. Anyway, yeah, we've talked about that a lot, you know, and we had that Salduck program, that Snyder Creek program for years. And we got quite a few, we broodstocked quite a few big fish, and it was pretty successful, and we ran pretty harmoniously with the wild fish at the same time, had a pretty good program. But I think we were starting to see some declines, and then we picked that as a gene bank river. But we also looked at, you know, trying to spawn some of these bigger, I think you said hatchery fish? So we're talking about segregated population?
Yeah, segregated population, unless broodstock from wild would be available. But I'm specifically talking about not just taking the largest fish that you get back, but the largest in each year class, if that makes sense. Because obviously, if you just take the largest ones, you're going to get all 5-year fish or 4-year fish, and that creates a problem in and of itself. But if you take it from the largest fish that are obviously the most physically fit from each year class, so if you had the largest 2-year, 3-year fish and 4-year fish, as opposed to taking the smaller ones in each of those year classes.
Yeah, we're finding that a lot of the segregated populations from scale data, reading scales, is primarily 3-year-olds on the segregated population. And I mean, same with coho. Sometimes you have a good, you have a very productive ocean and you see a little bit bigger fish, but we do have a few 4-year-olds in there as far as from the segregated population. But I don't know that, and I'm not a geneticist, so I don't know that necessarily taking from the biggest segregated population is going to equate to a bigger fish. I know we've done it at a few hatcheries where we've really tried to focus on, you know, like the 4-year-olds segregated population.
Well, do you think that taking
Yeah, I might,
taking the
sorry,
biggest,
I'm just going to interrupt for a minute. You know, we're so focused on, you know, kind of this wild conservation concern. And so Rob and I, this is the topic we've discussed. So if you don't mind, we circle back around on that one after.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a good question. We'll keep moving. I'll just mention real quick, this is that graph of the Chehalis River and the Quileute, steelhead and coho abundance moving through time. Some weird math on this gray line just to get these axes to kind of line up so they're easier to look at. You can see that, you know, these peaks often we see increase of both, but in the Quileute here, we see good coho returns often not followed by good steelhead returns. So a lot more to talk about there, but just at least gives us an idea that it's, you know, maybe not the next forecasting tool, but something worth asking.
Great, thanks, James. We're gonna go next to Mara Zimmerman, and Mara, I'm unmuting you now.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, hi, Mara.
Excellent. Hi, so thank you for a very informative presentation, and just really good to see this issue of wild steelhead on the outer coast being brought to being discussed in such a diverse forum, bringing the specific focus tonight on fisheries and harvest, but as has been mentioned, the importance of looking across hatcheries and habitat and harvest together is clearly the solution here is a mix of all, and so really appreciate the focus tonight on the fishery impact. I wanted to comment or sort of give my thoughts on the options that you have laid out. Of the four, number 3 would definitely be the one that I would lean toward, and just wanted to provide a little bit of some rationale for that. I like how you have laid out that we looking at factors affecting these populations, not just abundance, but also the distribution, the diversity, and the productivity, because that's very much sort of where my mind goes as well. An early closure, while wild steelhead may not have a large number of early returning fish, there are absolutely wild winter returning, wild winter steelhead returning early in the run. That is an important component of the run, and I think that focusing on the impacts across the entire wild winter steelhead run will serve us better into the future. There is a link between the temporal distribution of the run and the abundance of the run. And so that's my concern with option number 1. Option number 2, that spatial concentration into one area of the coast, both from a social economic perspective across the entire coastal region, but also I would anticipate that would really decrease the fishing experience and a lot of crowding in the Quileute system, as well as potentially really increasing the amount of impact to the population, to the steelhead in that river. And then lastly, closing option number 4, which is closing the fishery entirely. I think that we walk away from a very important asset to these fish, which are the people who are fishing on them and enjoy them and advocate for them. And for that reason, I think keeping some level of connection between anglers and the steelhead in these rivers is really important to their future. It's thinking about how we do it and understanding that it is going to take taking less by everyone, and that is a sacrifice at this point that needs to be made, and I think that a lot of the comments tonight reflect that. But closing and sort of disconnecting the anglers from the steelhead, I just don't see long term as bringing as many benefits as we might think. So thanks, James. Thanks for the opportunity to weigh in tonight.
Thanks so much, Mara.
Great, thank you, Mara. We're gonna go to another caller. Next is John McMillan. Go ahead, John. And John, you'll need to unmute on your end as well. All right, John, one more call here. You'll have to unmute if we're going to get a question from you. We're going to move to the next person on the list then.
And John also has contact information for me if he wants to text, if I can help in some way. Otherwise, the chat function, we can get some help for you.
Perfect. So next we've got a phone number starting in 360, ending in 3215. And we've got you unmuted on our end. Caller ending in 3215. You'll have to unmute on your end. And again, that prompt is *6 if you're calling from a landline. Going once, going twice. All right, we're gonna go next to Cameron Black. Cameron, I'm unmuting you now.
Hi there, Raquel. Thank you. You know, this is not really my place, as I don't generally participate in a lot of these fisheries, and I just wanted to kind of tune in tonight. And you know, one aspect that I really appreciate the WDFW having is, you know, the concern that, you know, without the sportsmen, without the fishermen, we lose our fish. And you know, we've got blueprints up and down the Washington and Oregon coast of where we have, you know, sports funded, sports participated broodstock programs that are performing well during bad ocean cycles. And I kind of want to stress that, because those places tend to be where everybody honestly goes when everything else is falling apart. So, you know, we impact, excuse me, we impact these fish, whether we're fly guys, whether we're sport guys, some way or another, we need to be contributing them. We can't put all the weight of our impacts just on these fish just to do what they do. I think that those blueprints are out there, and we need to look at that. I'm just wondering if at what point in time does the state want to manage and actually try something different? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, the short answer is, you know, there's an interest in looking at this differently right now, today. So I hear everything you're saying and really appreciate it. So thanks.
Thank you, Cameron. I should also mention, Cameron pointed out earlier when I think it was Nathan that brought up that we should have a guide logbook. Cameron, thank you for the reminder here. We do actually, just as of this past year, have a guide logbook in place, new rule by the commission. So if you want any more information on that, feel free to contact the DFW team and we'll get you more info. So we're gonna go next to a caller 253 ending in 1126. And you are unmuted.
Yeah, this is Patrick Gaffney again. I was just trying, I don't think I got an answer on a reason as to why the Quinault system was higher every year than all the other systems. And one, why is there no tribal representation tonight to kind of give their answer on their side of the story, since it's co-managed?
Yeah, so I can't tell you exactly why the Quinault's more stable than other rivers, but I would mention that, you know, the Quileut's also been extremely stable. One thing worth noting, so on that first piece in the statewide steelhead management plan, there's emphasis on these 4 parameters, not because, you know, they're fun to talk about, but rather the idea is there's long-term stability in those. And if you think of rivers like the Quileut, where you've got a number of tributaries that represent different geographic, you know, areas, they're extremely diverse, you know, and a consistent effort at meeting the escapement goal and success at doing that, we see those populations rebound. And the Quinault may be one of those that during those periods of low productivity, we met escapement in the times we needed to most. So that could be, but I mean, there's a lot of great opinions and science behind that. And then why the tribes aren't at this meeting is there wasn't an invitation for the tribes. You know, that co-management discussion happens between the state and the tribe, but I know there's folks on this call that chat about, you know, management perspectives among the tribe, and so this is really a focus on, we move into a room with our co-managers, and you know, we're not interested, if we've got a diversity of options here, we're not interested in putting options that are completely unpalatable by our anglers if there's a similar option that's preferred that provides the same conservation objectives. So the focus really tonight is to let you know sort of the way we're viewing our steelhead populations on the coast, you know, the concern we have for the status quo, and to hear what, you know, our constituents think about it. So maybe there's a different forum in the future that includes the tribes. I don't know, but thanks for the comment.
Great, thank you, James. And we only have time for one more question. We're going to go to Jonathan Stump. I've got you unmuted, and then we'll do some wrap up. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Raquel. Hey, Kelly. Hey, James. Appreciate you guys' time today. Thanks for laying out all these options. You know, it's with the 4 options that you guys have put out there, I think, you know, without getting too into the details, option 3 kind of seems like the best one to keep anglers and steelhead advocates on the water. I mean, you've heard that from numerous people today, from Mara, Cameron, Tom, a bunch of other people. Like, you know, without these anglers on the water, these steelhead lose their best advocates. But as this kind of, you know, moves forward, we definitely want to see kind of what those details look like before we can, you know, agree to support anything like that. Moving forward, though, you know, we really appreciate this kind of short-term willingness here, but to us, this is just a longer-term issue that has been ongoing. And, you know, we were in the same position last year, and we're in the same position this year, and we're going to be in the same position next year. And unless something dramatically changes, these fish are going to be headed for an ESA listing. You know, and Kelly said at the beginning of the meeting, I think someone else referenced it, that this is the status quo that's happening, and these runs are heading in a direction that even 5 years ago, the department didn't think we're in a downward trajectory. But, you know, thankfully you guys, you know, see that and are willing to do something about it. But now's the time to kind of step up and do something. You know, we want to keep these fisheries open and well managed, you know, avoid a listing, but we need a plan. And like, what's your vision? What's your vision for these coastwide stocks? You know, under the current management plan, there's no, you know, real plan to rebuild these stocks, and it threatens the long-term fisheries and opportunities. And, you know, hosting these town halls only weeks before these fishery management plans are supposed to be finalized with the co-managers just doesn't leave really room for any options to, you know, come together and cohesively figure this out. And, you know, Kelly and James, I know you guys have heard me say this, and it's nice to actually hear it from the larger community tonight, but I think for, you know, this to move forward in a positive way, we need to get an advisory group back together to figure out a coastwide plan and a vision to help the department manage these fish. So I'll leave it at that. Appreciate you guys' time, and let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah, Raquel, it seems like we're running out of time, but one thing I wanted to mention to folks is there were 2 sort of topics that came up a number of times. And one of them is this, that the statewide steelhead management plan isn't working and we need something different. I appreciate that perspective, but I'd like to lean on sort of our track record in conforming to the statewide management plan. And, you know, the 10% exploitation rate and escapement goals are outlined there. And I would suggest that we have not been successful meeting these. So that's why we really focused on that management plan, is that, you know, the sort of awareness that maybe, you know, there's other work that we could do to meet those goals. The other one is there was a number of folks that suggested options specifically in the Chehalis that required certain rivers, certain tributaries and main stem reaches open or closed. The reason you don't see those as options right now is based on uncertainty around how effort shifts. So if we close one section, do we have the same impact or potentially higher degree of impact in those rivers that are open because we, you know, have the same amount of effort that shifts? So we don't know. It's a tough numeric to come up with, but you know, we can go back to the drawing boards and see how that pencils out. So thanks.
Thanks for that, James. And then I know you've been busy answering questions, so I just want to say for your benefit that thanks to folks raising their hand and getting verbal questions in. We got through a lot of the questions that were in the Q&A as well. There were some management ideas that were in the
Raquel, we lost
Q&A
you there.
around,
Oh,
you know,
there you go.
targeting hatchery fish only or season. Oh, sorry about that. Just wanted to make sure folks knew that we're capturing the ideas, the management ideas that were in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that's a part of our thinking as we move forward. There was one really good question that I think is good to leave on, which is, you know, what's the process from here, James? How are we as an agency planning on taking this feedback and working it into our management approach?
Yeah, so it's November 24th. The target, you know, a couple months ago with the tribes, we said, hey, we need to push this, you know, a little harder, pedal to the metal, so we can, you know, have these pieces in place sooner than we have, you know, ever put together this meeting. So we did that hard work. We got to this, you know, point, and now we've got about a week to sit down with the tribe and describe how we want to go fishing this year, or if there's some alternative to going fishing that we're going to describe. So December 1 is typically when the steelhead management period begins. So this is when the majority of the fish that enter the river are hatchery origin. So my target would be by December 1, we've got a fisheries plan signed by all of our co-managers, one that the Olympic National Park is supportive of, and that, you know, a plan that represents, you know, our conservation objectives and also things we heard on the calls today. So specifically the gear restriction, you know, option 3 is one that I heard some sort of changes to, some suggestions. So there's some technical work there before we begin planning seasons to see how that looks. And then I heard some changes to, I think it's option 1, the closure early. There, you know, I think we heard maybe Tom Moonen, maybe not, maybe it was Patrick suggested moving this date to February 1. So there's some math associated with, if you have a fishery that typically closes March 31st and you move it to February 1, what type of savings do we expect there, and how would that potentially affect diversity, productivity, and abundance? So so a little bit of math, but we hope within the next week and a half, we've you know, got fisheries packages that we're really confident in moving forward, or I should say a plan.
That's February 20th, not 1.
Yeah, I meant December 1. Sorry if I misspoke there. Thanks for the clarification.
Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for answering that, James. And
Patrick.
I wasn't sure if you wanted to cover anything else in your final remarks, or turn it over to Kelly to say some closing remarks.
Yeah, I would say, Raquel, thanks, is, you know, just I really appreciate this. I heard some good ideas, you know, in terms of, you know, just collaboration. It sounds like that one kind of echoed through a bunch of people's comments that, you know, we need to be talking more. So you know, this meeting's going to end here tonight, but I'm not going anywhere. The team you saw today is a group that's going to be around for a while, and we're working at a speed that I think is record breaking. So we're really excited. We're, you know, extremely passionate, and we want to hear your ideas. So if the next communication like this happens before next year this time, you know, we're excited about that. So please keep throwing ideas our way. And I felt a lot of support for managing steelhead on the coast. And, you know, that makes me excited. So thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. Kelly.
Yeah, thanks, James. So just want to thank your team too, James. Appreciate the effort here. Appreciate them hanging in late on a Tuesday on a holiday weekend. So thanks team. And I want to again just reiterate my appreciation for, you know, the almost 160 folks who again carved time out of their evening to join us. We got a lot of good feedback. This was very helpful. I found it very valuable. I hope you were able to pull some value out of it. If you've got questions that didn't get answered, or if something else comes to mind, please do not hesitate to reach out to James or myself. We want to be as comprehensive as we can with our responses, and we want to build a model like this into the future. So we're having these types of conversations in advance and sharing with you, the data that we have, the thoughts that we have, and getting your reaction and responses to that. So again, thanks for this evening. Take care. I hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving and a good long weekend. If that's in your in your future, I'm not sure it's in mine, but thank you, greatly appreciated, and have a great night, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.